Yeah, I know it's Halloween and this isn't exactly the most terrifying game in the world. I'd picked this out because I had fond memories of it as a kid, but I couldn't remember an awful lot about it. And it had Transylvania in the title, so I presumed it'd have something spooky in it. It doesn't. Well, sort of. This title music. This title music does remind me of something that did used to terrify me as a kid. So there's your Halloween tie-in. Deal with that. Spike in Transylvania was released in 1991 by Codemasters and was put together by a three-man team. Paul Griffiths, who had experience working on games such as Steg the Slug and Dizzy Down the Rapids. Lyndon Sharp, who had previously worked on games such as Captain Dynamo and Bubble Dizzy. And Russell Newman, who had worked on, well, not a great deal, Lop Ears, which was released the same year, and Dominion Dawn of New Eden, which never saw the light of day. All in all, the team's developers had a mixed bag of quality under their belt, from really good to really, please, no, stop, I hate this. But for the most part, this was a team who had experience, and coming as late as Spike in Transylvania did in the Spectrum's life, it definitely shows just how proficient coders had become by the time the 90s rolled around. Firstly, it looks great. It has big, chunky, characterful sprites that are well animated and clearly depicted. It's a game that, certainly in 1991, I was absolutely drawn to based on the graphics alone, even if the lead character is basically just Hagar the Horrible. There's a huge amount of detail in this world, and everything moves at a decently rapid pace. It feels like the ultimate cartoon adventure that the Darling brothers always told us Dizzy was, because they were big liars. And before we carry on, this cover art, while it's fantastic, can I just point out a few things? There are no dragons in this game. There are no ogres in this game. You never use a weapon. The screenshots on the back are taken from the C64 version of the game. Codemasters really knew how to sell a game on the back of little white lies, I'll give them that. Anyway, back to the game in question, and back to that graphical finesse, because while the game is nicely detailed and relatively pretty to look at, there are a few issues at play. Firstly, the colour clash. It's not too bad in the castle areas where everything is largely filtered through one solid mass of colour, but in the village areas and a few other sections, the mess of colours aren't particularly handled too well. Couple this with the fact that everything feels layered and textured and, oh, what's this? I've just picked something up and half my health has vanished. It's a bit too busy is what I'm trying to get at, and it's pretty easy to walk right into an enemy that you didn't even notice. Enemies at least move around though, giving you a chance to spot them, but apples don't move, that's a fact. And apples in this game will absolutely hammer your health bar. I'm not entirely sure why, it doesn't really explain. I'm going to assume that they're poisoned. The manual probably goes into it, but regardless, there's only a couple of apples in the entire game, and you'll no doubt forget that you're supposed to leave them well alone and walk right over them anyway. Either because you didn't see them in the mess of graphical blah, or because food typically heals you. Food heals you in this game. Apples hurt you. That's just the kind of logic you're going to have to deal with. None of that would matter too much if the game wasn't so slippery in the control department. You're on a pseudo 3D plane here, and trying to work out where you are in relation to enemies is just all over the place. Why do I lose energy when I'm walking here, but I don't lose energy walking here? If this drip from the doorway stops here, then why am I being killed by standing here? The enemies will absolutely sap the health right out of your bones for merely glancing past them, and it's one of those games where you have a health bar, but it's a health bar that's used mostly to show you just how weak and pathetic the lead character is. If a mouse gently touches your foot, you can say goodbye to about 50% of your health. There are, as mentioned, food items that you can pick up to alleviate this, but not many. So thankfully you get a decent stack of lives here to try and complete the game, which is good, because there is a lot of bullshit. I mean, seriously, how am I supposed to deal with that? Or that? It's one of the age-old problems with games of this era, and I know all I've done for the past 862 words is moan and complain about all the things I don't like, but there is a reason for that. As a kid, from memory, I loved Spike in Transylvania, and there's still a hell of a lot to like here now. I want to get as many of my issues with the game out of the way first before I can discuss what I do actually like about it. So that's me done complaining. Mostly. I'm mostly done complaining. There might be some more later. So, let's rewind. What is the game all about? You're tasked with rescuing your band of burly Vikings who have all been locked away in the castle dungeons, and in order to succeed at this mission, you've got to go around solving some admittedly simple puzzles while avoiding enemies using the power of luck. Sorry, couldn't help myself. The joy in this game is that it feels brisk and easy, it has charm, and it has character. Fairly early on in the game, you'll come across a guy who won't let you access the local tavern without a tie, which is just amusing on its own, to be fair. A Viking in a tie. Nonsense. You then spend the rest of the game solving various other puzzles, one of which requires multiple items in order to solve it. The wizard, who you'll find halfway up the tower, requires 3 specific items in order to cast a magic spell, and it's never actually mentioned what the spell will do, you just know that you need to do it because that's a puzzle in the game. So you get all the items, you bring them back to him, and you put them in the cauldron, and it makes a tie. Of course it does, what else would it make? There's almost never a point in Spike in Transylvania where you'll feel stuck and be scratching your head on what to do. There's always a forward motion to the game, and it's refreshing to not feel consistently confused on where to go next. Couple that with the fact you can hold 6 items at any given time, and the only backtracking that you'll be really required to do is simply to reach the areas in which you have to solve the puzzle. You're not spending your entire time in-game sorting out your inventory or leaving things in places that you'll hopefully remember later. It keeps you pushing forward. Up to a point. Up to a point. I'd managed to get through the entirety of this game all the way up to a couple of locked doors that I just couldn't figure out. And I'm not ashamed to admit that for this last section I had to check a guide to see what I'd missed. And without spoiling the puzzle solutions, it turns out that a couple of the enemies that you'll see in the castle, specifically the guards in front of the locked doors, they're not like all the other enemies that you come across in Spike. They're NPCs. NPCs that you have to talk to. NPCs that request specific items. There is no indication that this is the case. I spent the entire game running toward the door with a key in hand before running away to avoid damage, because the game specifically teaches you that these enemies will damage you. I had no reason to believe that these specific enemies did not behave like every other enemy in the game. Where experimentation is required, it feels unfair, or at the very least absent-minded of the developers, to allow you to be hurt in one instance, but then require you to ignore that had happened previously, and just assume that in this particular case it definitely won't happen again. The game can be unclear and sloppy like this. It can, for instance, confuse you by not having items activate unless you're stood in exactly the correct place. It makes you look elsewhere. Even when you have the solution to hand, you were doing everything right outside the fact you weren't doing it in exactly the right way. And that can get frustrating. But not as frustrating as this music. Yeah, that gets old. That gets old real fast. Let's reel it all back in, though. I've said a lot of things here that are completely against the game, and as I've already said, I don't hate Spike in Transylvania. In fact, I'd even go as far as to say I like it. I do like it. I like it a lot. And that's where a lot of my complaints end up stemming from. Each time I want to truly fall in love with Spike in Transylvania, it manages to do something that pisses me off. For each nice graphical touch, it manages to make something muddy or difficult to parse. For each catchy intro theme, it introduces an in-game theme that loops after about 5 seconds. For each simple puzzle solution, it introduces an element of finicky bullshit. Much like the developer's history, it is a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag that I'm still, having spouted all this, going to recommend. And I recommend it because despite all its flaws, it still manages to be a charming, brisk puzzle game with plenty of elements that will end up putting a smile on your face, even if it tries to fishhook that smile right off your big, gormless head. It can be unfair, it can be fist-fightingly frustrating, but it can also be completed in about 45 minutes, and so long as you don't accidentally eat an apple that you didn't quite see, it can keep you entertained enough within that 45 minutes so that the flaws themselves don't stick too hard. It's the strange case of a great game wrapped up in a clumsy package that still, in the end, manages to come out better than a lot of the games on the Spectrum that tried to do the same thing. Just don't say I didn't warn you about those bastard apples.